Eastern Montana, February 1949. Nobody driving past the weathered red barn on Route 13 could have guessed what was inside. From the road, it looked like any other homestead structure. Peeling paint, sagging roofline, a thin curl of smoke from a stovepipe that seemed almost apologetic against the gray winter sky. But Ellen Warwick wasn't heating a barn. She was heating something most folks in Dawson County would have called crazy. A surplus military Quonset hut, 12 feet wide, 16 feet long, sitting right in the middle of her barn like a steel egg in a wooden nest. That woman's lost her mind, they said at the feed store, living in scrap metal like some kind of refugee. What they didn't know, what they couldn't see from the road or from their warm parlors in town, was that Ellen had stumbled onto something the old-timers would have recognized immediately. Something the Norwegians called hus I hus, house within house. Something the Inuit had known for centuries with their snow tunnels and double-wall shelters. She'd created a thermal buffer without knowing the term for it. And when the blizzard of 1949 rolled across the high plains with winds that would peel the paint off a locomotive and temperatures that would make grown men weep, that crazy idea would be the only thing standing between Ellen Warwick and a frozen grave. If you've ever wondered how people survived extreme cold without modern heating, you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button, because every week I bring you real survival techniques that worked when lives depended on it. And drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? I want to know how many of you understand what real winter means. Ellen Warwick became a widow in the autumn of 1947. Her husband, Robert, died when his tractor rolled on the south slope. Quick, they said, which was meant to be a comfort, but never was. She was 34 years old. No children. No family within 300 miles. Just 160 acres of Montana scrubland. A barn that was older than statehood, and a winter that didn't care about her circumstances. The farmhouse had burned 2 years prior. A chimney fire that took everything except the foundation and Robert's stubborn optimism. They'd been living in the barn ever since, planning to rebuild when times got better. Times never got better. Now Ellen was alone with a structure that was never meant for human habitation. The barn was drafty, cavernous, impossible to heat. 40 feet long, 24 feet wide. Gaps between the boards you could slide a playing card through. The few times she tried to heat it with the old cast-iron stove, the warmth went straight up through the hayloft and out into the Montana sky. She'd burn through a week's worth of wood in 2 days and still wake up to frost on the inside of the walls. February 1948 nearly killed her. She'd spent most of that winter huddled within 5 feet of the stove, burning furniture when the woodpile ran low, wearing every piece of clothing she owned. When the first thaw came in March, she'd lost 16 pounds and couldn't feel her toes for a week. She knew she wouldn't survive another winter like that. The problem wasn't just the cold. It was the fuel. Coal was expensive and had to be hauled from Miles City, 37 miles each way on roads that became impassable for weeks at a time. Wood meant chopping, hauling, and storing. Work she could manage in summer, but barely maintain once the ground froze. And there was simply too much space to heat. Every BTU she generated was swallowed by that vast, hungry volume of air. That's when she saw the advertisement in the Billings Gazette. Military surplus, Quonset huts, steel construction, 20 by 16 and 20 by 12 available. Built for extreme conditions. $75 or best offer. $75 was most of her savings. But the idea lodged in her mind like a splinter. A smaller space. Metal that would hold heat. Something designed for survival, not for storing hay. The men at the surplus yard in Billings looked at her like she'd asked to buy a submarine. "Ma'am, these huts need a foundation," the yard foreman said, not unkindly. "Concrete pad. Proper anchoring. You can't just set one up in a field." "I'm not putting in a field," Ellen said. "I'm putting in my barn." The foreman blinked. "Twice. You're putting a building inside a building?" "That's right." "Why in hell would you do that?" Ellen looked at him straight. "Because I can't heat 40 feet of barn, but I might be able to heat 16 feet of steel." He sold her the smallest Quonset for $40, probably just to get rid of her. He even helped load it onto her truck. 4 curved sections that bolted together, plus end walls and a door. The whole thing weighed maybe 800 pounds, which meant she could assemble it herself if she took her time. When she drove it home and started unloading the sections into the barn, her nearest neighbor, Frank Holloway, rode over on his mare. "Ellen, what in God's name are you doing?" "Building a place to live." "In the barn." "In the barn." Frank was 63 years old and had survived 40 Montana winters. He scratched his jaw and looked at the curved steel sections lying in the dirt. "Metal's colder than wood, Ellen. That thing'll be like living in an icebox." "Maybe," Ellen said, "but it'll be a small icebox, and the barn will keep the wind off it. Barn's got more holes than a sieve. Still better than nothing." Frank shook his head slowly. "You're gonna freeze in there, mark my words. That's not how a woman should live. Hell, that's not how anybody should live." But Ellen had made her decision. She'd spent one winter losing toes and 20 pounds to that barn's emptiness. She'd spend this winter in steel, even if the whole county thought she'd lost her mind. It took Ellen 3 weeks to assemble the Quonset hut inside the barn. She worked methodically, mostly in the mornings when her hands were steadiest. The sections bolted together with a logic she appreciated. No wasted motion, no decorative flourishes, just function. 4 arched ribs, corrugated steel panels, 2 end walls with a door in one and a stovepipe port in the other. She positioned it carefully in the southeast corner of the barn, where the roof was most intact and the walls had the fewest gaps. Left 5 feet of clearance on all sides, enough to walk around it, enough for air to circulate, enough that if something went wrong she could get out. The stovepipe was the trickiest part. She ran it straight up through the Quonset's port, then angled it through the barn's existing chimney chase. Double wall, metal separated from wood by 8 inches of air and a layer of sand. No shortcuts on fire safety, not after what happened to the house. When she was finished, she stood back and looked at what she'd built. From the outside, it looked absurd. A corrugated steel half-cylinder squatting inside a weathered barn like a tin someone had forgotten to throw away. Ugly, makeshift, desperate. From the inside, it was something else entirely. 12 feet wide at the base, 7 feet high at the crown, 192 square feet of space, roughly the size of a small bedroom. The steel walls curved overhead in a continuous arc, no corners for heat to pool and die. A small window on the south end let in winter light. The door sealed tight with a rubber gasket salvaged from an old truck. She installed her cast-iron stove in the center, vented it properly, and made her first fire on a cold October morning. The difference was immediate. The barn was 42 degrees. The Quonset, within an hour, was 68. The physics were simple, though Ellen didn't think of it in those terms. The barn blocked the wind. Wind was the killer in Montana winter. Not just the cold, but the convective force that stripped heat from any surface faster than you could generate it. The barn's wooden walls, gaps and all, reduced wind speed from 30 miles per hour to near zero. That alone cut heat loss by more than half. The air gap between the barn and the Quonset created a buffer zone. Dead air doesn't conduct heat well. It's why double-pane windows work, why old-timers stuff straw between wall studs, why the best wilderness shelters always have 2 layers. The barn's interior air, warmed slightly by the Quonset's radiant heat, formed an insulating envelope. Not warm enough to live in, but warm enough to slow the bleeding of heat from the inner shell. The steel itself, which Frank Holloway said would be like living in an icebox, was actually an asset. Steel conducts heat quickly and evenly. No cold spots, no drafts. The corrugated surface increased surface area, radiating warmth in all directions. And the small volume, 1/10 the size of the barn, meant her stove could actually keep up. 3 logs every 4 hours instead of half a cord every 6. She also discovered something she hadn't planned for. The Quonset acted as a drying chamber for her firewood. She stacked split wood in the space between the hut and the barn wall. The radiant heat from the steel dried it faster than any woodshed could. Wet wood that would have smoldered and filled the barn with smoke burned clean and hot within 48 hours of being brought inside. By November, Ellen had the system running smoothly. Wake at 5 a.m., feed the stove. By 6 a.m., the interior was 65 degrees. The stove held coals for 12 hours if she banked it properly. At night, she'd let it burn down to embers, and the temperature would drop to maybe 55 degrees by morning, cold enough to see your breath, but nothing like the bone-cracking freeze of the barn itself. She slept better than she had in 2 years. But the people of Dawson County didn't measure success by sleep quality. The talk started at the Sunday service in late November. Ellen didn't go to church often. The 10-mile drive was hard on the truck, and she'd never felt comfortable with the pitying looks people gave the widow Warwick. But she needed supplies before the first real snow, so she made the trip to town and stopped by the mercantile. Margaret Hensley was working the counter. "Ellen," she said, with that particular tone women use when they're about to say something they think is kind but isn't. "I heard you're living in some kind of metal shed." "It's a Quonset hut," Ellen said. "Army surplus." "Inside your barn?" "That's right." Margaret's face did something complicated. "Honey, that's not how people live. That's how soldiers live in the desert. You're a woman. You should have proper home." "I have a roof and a stove," Ellen said. "That's more than I had last winter." At the post office, Harold Jenkins was less tactful. "Heard you're camping in a tin can, Ellen." "That true? It's warmer than you'd think." "I bet it is. Like a Dutch oven in summer and a meat locker in winter." He laughed, but there was an edge to it. "You know, if you need help, there's ways to ask. Don't have to live like some kind of refugee." Ellen thanked him quietly and left. By December, the story had made the rounds. The widow Warwick, living in military scrap metal like a hermit or a lunatic. People had opinions. Most of them were delivered secondhand, through sympathetic intermediaries who assured her they were just concerned. Frank Holloway stopped by again, this time with his son-in-law, Carl, a carpenter who'd built half the houses in Miles City. "Ellen," Carl said, walking around the Quonset with his hands in his pockets, "I'm going to be straight with you. This is a bad idea." "It's working," Ellen said. "Now, maybe, but you're creating a condensation trap. That steel's going to sweat like a horse in summer, and in winter, it's going to frost on the inside. You'll have ice on your walls by January. And God forbid something happens to that stove, you'll freeze before you can get out of there." "I've thought about the condensation," Ellen said, which was true. She'd been airing it out every morning, and so far the frost was minimal. "And I've got ventilation ports in both end walls." Carl shook his head. "You're gambling with your life for what? Stubbornness? Pride? Survival?" Ellen said quietly. "I'm gambling with my life for survival." Carl looked at Frank. Frank shrugged. They left without saying goodbye. The hardest moment came just before Christmas, when Pastor Yates drove out to see her. He was a kind man, in his way. He sat in the barn and looked at the Quonset hut and didn't say anything for a long time. "Ellen," he said finally, "this isn't dignity. This is desperation, and desperation makes people do things that look foolish to others." "Does it look foolish to you?" Ellen asked. "It looks like you've given up on being part of the world." "I've given up on freezing to death," Ellen said. "That's not the same thing." Pastor Yates sighed. "If you need help, real help, not this, you know we'd find a way." "I know," Ellen said. She didn't know. They'd find her a room in town, maybe with the Hensleys or the Pratts. She'd be warm and fed and pitted every single day. She'd lose the farm, lose the land, lose the last piece of Robert and the life they'd try to build. She'd rather freeze. After the pastor left, Ellen sat in the Quonset with the stove crackling and thought about what Carl had said. A condensation trap. A meat locker. A bad idea. Maybe they were right. Maybe this was desperation dressed up as resourcefulness. Maybe she was a widow, so hollowed out by grief that she convinced herself that living in scrap metal was a victory instead of a surrender. But the hut was 68 degrees. The stove was burning clean. Her firewood was drying faster than she could split it. The numbers didn't lie, even if the people did. The storm arrived on February 11th, 1949. The weathermen in Billings had been tracking it for 3 days, a massive low-pressure system barreling down from Alberta, dragging Arctic air and moisture in equal measure. They said it would be bad. They didn't say it would be the worst blizzard to hit Montana in 45 years. Ellen heard the wind change at 3 a.m. It started as a low moan in the barn's rafters, then rose to a shriek that sounded almost human. She got out of bed and opened the Quonset's door just far enough to look out. The barn was already filling with snow, fine, powdery stuff that found every crack and gap in the walls and came through like smoke. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in 2 hours. She sealed the door and fed the stove. By dawn, the wind was hitting sustained speeds of 60 miles per hour, with gusts over 70. The barn shook. The Quonset, anchored to the dirt floor with steel stakes and cables, held steady. Ellen couldn't see the road anymore, couldn't see the fence line, couldn't see anything beyond 10 feet. The first day, she kept the stove going and stayed inside. She had enough wood stacked in the barn to last 2 weeks if she was careful. Water from the hand pump, frozen solid by noon, which meant melting snow. Food, canned goods, dried beans, cornmeal. She'd weathered storms before, but this wasn't a storm. This was a siege. Day 2, the temperature outside hit 18 below zero. Inside the barn, it was 4 above, cold enough to freeze water, but not cold enough to kill immediately. Inside the Quonset, with the stove running steady, it was 63 degrees. Ellen started to understand what she'd built. The barn's temperature told her the heat loss rate of a standard shelter in this kind of wind and cold. Even with wooden walls and some residual warmth from the Quonset, the barn couldn't hold temperature above freezing. A normal house would fare better. Tighter construction, insulation, but not by much. Not in winds like this. Not at 18 below. The Quonset, buried in the barn's shelter, held. Day 3, she heard something crash on the north side. A section of barn siding ripping loose and slamming into the wall. More snow poured through the gap. The barn's interior temperature dropped to 0. The Quonset stayed at 62. She thought about her neighbors. Frank Holloway, 2 miles south, in his 100-year-old farmhouse with a big stone fireplace. Carl Jensen in Miles City, with his carpenter-perfect home and modern oil furnace. Pastor Yates in the rectory with its coal stove and thick plaster walls. They had to be burning fuel like madmen just to keep pipes from freezing. Ellen fed her stove 3 times a day and stayed warm. Day 4, the wind died enough for her to venture out to the woodpile. The snow was drifted 6 feet high against the south wall of the barn. The temperature was still 12 below. She loaded her arms with split wood and hurried back to the hut, fingers numb even through her gloves. The wood she'd stacked between the Quonset and the barn wall was dry as bone. The wood outside was encased in ice. Day 5, the storm broke. The wind stopped. The sky cleared. The temperature plummeted to 22 below in the dead, still air. Ellen opened the Quonset's door and stepped into the barn. Frost coated every surface, the walls, the rafters, the tools hanging from nails. The barn was a frozen cathedral. The Quonset behind her was 68 degrees. If you're wondering how the rest of the county handled this storm, stay with me. Because what Ellen survived with ease nearly broke the people who'd called her crazy. Hit that like button if you're starting to see why the old ways worked. The blizzard of 1949 lasted 5 days, but the cold that followed lasted 3 weeks. Roads were impassable for 9 days. The county snowplow didn't make it out to the rural routes until February 23rd. During those 2 weeks of isolation, eastern Montana became a laboratory for thermal efficiency, whether people wanted it to be or not. Frank Holloway burned through his entire woodpile in the first week. His farmhouse, built in 1889 with good timber and careful craftsmanship, had a massive stone fireplace in the main room and a smaller stove in the kitchen. Under normal winter conditions, it was one of the warmest houses in the county. But normal winter wasn't 18 below zero with 60-mile-per-hour winds. Frank told Ellen later, much later after his pride had healed, that he'd burned everything that would fit in the firebox. Fence posts, furniture, the wooden door from the summer kitchen. He'd kept the main room at 52 degrees and let the rest of the house freeze. His wife slept in her coat. His daughter, visiting from Billings, said she could see her breath at the breakfast table. In Miles City, Carl Jensen's oil furnace ran continuously for 6 days straight. His fuel tank, which normally lasted a month, went dry in 8 days. He had to borrow oil from his neighbor and pay triple the usual rate. His house never got warmer than 61 degrees, and his monthly heating bill was more than his mortgage. Pastor Yates, in the rectory, burned coal around the clock. The coal stove in the parlor glowed red-hot, and still the upstairs bedrooms dropped below 40 degrees. He moved his bed downstairs and slept 5 feet from the stove, waking every 3 hours to feed it. He went through 2 tons of coal, a month's supply, in 12 days. These are good houses, well-built, maintained. These are structures that had survived 40 Montana winters, and they were barely holding on. Ellen Warwick, in her tin can inside a drafty barn, slept through the night. When the roads finally cleared and Frank Holloway made the trip over to check on her, he half expected to find a corpse. What he found instead was Ellen sitting at her small table, reading a book with the Quonset's interior temperature at 68 degrees. "Jesus Christ," Frank said. Ellen looked up. "I'm fine, Frank. Thanks for checking. How much wood did you burn?" Ellen thought about it. "Maybe a cord. Cord and a half." Frank stared at her. "I burned 3 cords. 3. And I nearly froze. You were heating a whole house. You're in a goddamn metal can." "A small metal can," Ellen said, "inside a barn that blocked the wind." Frank walked around the Quonset slowly, touching the steel, feeling the warmth radiating from it. He looked at the woodpile between the hut and the barn wall, dry, neatly stacked, barely diminished. He looked at the stove, banked low with coals, not even working hard. "How long does the heat last?" he asked. "After I let the fire die down?" "The temperature holds above 60 for about 4 hours. Drops to maybe 55 by morning. I just bank it at night and rebuild in the morning." "And you're comfortable?" "More comfortable than I was in the farmhouse," Ellen said, "before it burned." Frank sat down heavily on the wooden chair Ellen kept by the door. "I don't understand it." "It's simple," Ellen said. "Small space, windbreak, dead air insulation. The barn does half the work. The hut does the rest." What Ellen didn't say, what she was only beginning to understand herself, was that she'd accidentally recreated a principle that cold climate peoples had known for centuries. The Sami in their lavu tents inside turf shelters. The Inuit with their igloos and snow tunnels. The Norwegian stabber with its double walls. The Russian izbas with their nested rooms and antechambers. Layered shelter wasn't primitive. It was sophisticated. The barn blocked convective heat loss, the wind that would strip warmth from any surface. The air gap between barn and Quonset created an insulating buffer that reduced conductive heat loss by roughly 60%. The small volume of the Quonset meant minimal air to heat, 192 cubic feet versus the barn's 23,000. And the steel, that metal that everyone said would freeze her to death, conducted heat so evenly that there were no cold spots, no drafts, no corners where warmth went to die. Every BTU her stove generated stayed in that small space, radiating from the walls, the ceiling, the curved surfaces that reflected heat back toward the center. Frank did some calculations later, sitting at his kitchen table with a pencil and the back of an envelope. He figured Ellen was maintaining a 70-degree temperature differential, 68 inside, 2 below outside, with roughly 1/3 the fuel he was burning to maintain a 40-degree differential. She was 3 times more efficient. 3 times. When word got around, and in Dawson County, word always got around, people started asking questions. Not mocking questions this time. Real questions. How much did the hut cost? Where did you get it? How did you set it up? What about condensation? What about ventilation? What about fire safety? Ellen answered every question honestly. $40 for the hut. Surplus yard in Billings. Bolted together in 3 weeks. Condensation was manageable with twice daily airing. Ventilation ports in both end walls. Stovepipe clearances per code, double wall through the barn structure, sand barrier between metal and wood. The number that stuck in everyone's mind was the fuel consumption. Ellen Warwick heated her living space through the worst blizzard in 45 years on a cord and a half of wood. Her neighbors, in conventional houses with conventional heating, burned 3 times that much and were less comfortable. The widow in the tin can had beaten them at their own game, and she'd done it by accident. By the winter of 1950, 4 families in Dawson County had built nested shelters. None of them were exact copies of Ellen's setup. People adapted the principle to what they had and what they needed. Frank Holloway built a 12 by 14-foot cabin inside his barn. Not military surplus. He framed it himself with 2x4s and plywood, insulated with sawdust, sealed it tight. He used it as a winter retreat, heating it with a small barrel stove while letting the main house go cold. Cut his fuel consumption by half, and slept warmer than he had in 20 years. The Pritchett family, who ran a cattle operation 15 miles north, converted their equipment shed, put up interior walls to create a small insulated room within the larger structure, moved a cot and a stove in there for the winter months. Their teenage son, who'd been complaining about the cold upstairs bedroom, moved into the shed room and said it was better than the house. Carl Jensen, the carpenter who'd told Ellen she was gambling with her life, built the most sophisticated version. He constructed a tight, insulated core room inside his workshop, with proper vapor barriers and double-pane windows. Used it as a winter office and emergency shelter. Told people it was just an experiment in efficient heating, but everyone knew where he'd gotten the idea. Even Pastor Yates made changes. He didn't build a structure within a structure, but he did seal off the upstairs of the rectory completely, installed heavy curtains to isolate the downstairs parlor, and created what he called a winter room, essentially a heated core within the larger building. His coal consumption dropped by a third. The principle spread quietly, organically, the way useful knowledge always spreads in rural communities. Not through newspapers or official channels, but through conversations at the feed store, comparisons of fuel bills, tours of modified barns and sheds. People saw what worked. They adapted it. They didn't call it innovation. They called it common sense. By 1952, the county agricultural extension agent mentioned seasonal space reduction and layered shelter techniques in his winter preparation bulletin. He didn't cite Ellen Warwick by name, but everyone knew the source. Ellen herself became a quiet reference point. People would drive out to see the Quonset, to understand how she'd set it up, to ask about ventilation and condensation and stove placement. She answered every question patiently, showed them the air gap, explained the wind-break principle, demonstrated how she dried her firewood using radiant heat. She never said, "I told you so." She never needed to. The numbers had done that for her. What's remarkable, looking back, is how unremarkable the whole thing became. By the mid-1950s, nested winter shelters were common enough in eastern Montana that they barely warranted comment. The practice had merged into the background of rural survival knowledge, another tool in the kit, another technique that made sense when you thought about it. The old-timers recognized it for what it was, a rediscovery of ancient wisdom. The Norwegians had done it. The Sami had done it. The Russians had done it. Every culture that faced serious cold had figured out, eventually, that heating space was expensive, but heating less space was genius. Ellen Warwick hadn't invented anything. She just remembered something the modern world had forgotten. That efficiency trumps comfort, that physics doesn't care about your pride, and that sometimes the crazy solution is the only one that makes sense. She lived in that Quonset hut for another 7 years. In 1956, she finally rebuilt the farmhouse, a small, tight, well-insulated structure that owed more than a little to what she'd learned from living in steel. She kept the Quonset, though, used it as storage, as a workshop, as a reminder. And every winter, when the wind came screaming down from Alberta and the temperature dropped below zero, she'd walk out to the barn and touch the curved metal wall and think about the blizzard of 1949, the storm that everyone survived, but that she survived in comfort. There's a lesson there, buried in the Montana snow and the condensation on corrugated steel. A lesson about resource efficiency and thermal physics and the wisdom of making do. A lesson about how the best survival strategies are often the simplest ones, the ones that work with nature instead of against it, the ones that reduce the problem instead of fighting it head-on. Ellen Warwick understood something that the modern world, with its central heating and insulated walls and thermostats set to 72 degrees, had forgotten. You don't need to heat everything. You just need to heat enough. Sometimes the smallest space is the smartest space. Sometimes the shelter inside the shelter is the one that saves your life. Now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me. Where are you watching from, And what's the coldest winter you've ever faced? Have you ever used any kind of layered shelter technique? Let's share survival knowledge, because you never know when these old lessons might save your life. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.